Okay, I think it's working. All right, so I wanted to kind of really informally, I want to talk about the tithe, and let me make sure this is, I don't know if you can see me, I'm using this program here, but I wanted to talk about this, not in a, so I wanted to issue a challenge, but not in a way that's kind of, I'm right, you're wrong, I dare you to prove me wrong, but in a sincere attempt to kind of look at the discussion of the tithe, because I've heard people who support the tithe, and they say, the New Testament, for instance, I've heard people say that because sort of in Matthew 5, Jesus seems to up the ante on certain things like committing adultery. He says, you've heard that, you shouldn't commit adultery. I say you shouldn't even look at a woman lustfully, or if you do, you've committed adultery in your heart. And so they say, well, in the Old Testament it was 10%, so there sort of seems to be this principle of upping the ante, which I disagree with. I think the whole purpose of Matthew 5 was helping the Jews see they didn't keep the law, but nonetheless, they sort of use that to support the tithe, and they say, well, it's a commandment in the Old Testament, so we should still give 10%. And so I wanted to talk about why I don't believe in tithe, but also I wanted to ask people, I'm willing to be wrong, but only if someone is able to reason with me through the scriptures, kind of like Paul did in the book of Acts. And I'm willing to be wrong, but and not that I want to discard anyone's testimony of how, maybe once they struggled with money and then they started tithing and then, God began to bless them and that sort of thing. It's not that that's a bad thing or that that's not important, but that doesn't prove that tithing is a commandment. And so that's what I want to talk about specifically is why I believe tithing is not a commandment to the church today. And there's a few reasons. First thing is, I don't believe tithe has anything to do with one's income in the Old Testament. So if you're going to extend that even to the New Testament, so if you're going to say, well, there's never been God's never sort of said, don't keep that commandment. So like some people talk about circumcision, how that's specifically stated in the New Testament that that's no longer a commandment. And how it spoke of spiritual things, us being circumcised of the heart, and that sort of thing. So they say there's no specific commandment denouncing or saying no longer should we tithe. So we're still sort of obligated or need to keep that commandment. And again, not in the sense that we're under the law, but in the sense that our conscience is bound by the law, and that we are called to keep the commandments of God in love for Christ. So, but I have some scriptures up here, and I just wanted to read them. And again, I'm only quoting one scripture, but I want to sort of leave it up to you to look at the context. I'm going to do my best not to take it out of context. But the first thing I want to talk about is the fact that the tithe had nothing to do with one's income, but had to do with the increase of the land and of sheep and livestock. So in Leviticus 27:30 it says, "And all the tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the tree, is the Lord's. It is holy unto the Lord." And in this verse here, Leviticus 27:32, it says, "And concerning the tithe of the herd or of the flock, even of whatsoever passeth under the rod, the 10th shall be holy unto the Lord." So again, it's not talking about income so much as it's talking about the increase of the food and of the flock, the flock. And I want to look through here. Let's see, speaking of Levites, so I want to go to Deuteronomy because that's an interesting place. So Deuteronomy 12:11 says, "Then there shall be a place which the Lord your God shall choose to cause his name to dwell there. Thither shall ye bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings and your sacrifices, your tithes and the heave offering of your hand, and all your choice vows which ye shall vow." Okay, maybe that's not what. Okay, so 12:17 is what I'm really looking for. "Thou mayest not eat within thy gates the tithe of thy corn, or of the wine, or of thy oil, or the firstlings of thy herds, or of thy flock, nor any of thy vows which thou vowest, nor thy freewill offerings, or heave offerings of thy hand." So again, you see here, he's making specific what a tithe is, of the corn, of the wine, of the oil, of the firstlings of the herd. So again, there's nothing here about income, and there never is in the Old Testament. And so, but here's where people sort of make a kind of twist things. They say, well, back then they didn't really have money. Okay. Well, that's not true. If you read Old Testament scripture, even in the time of Pharaoh, there was money. And what's interesting is even in Deuteronomy, let's see, truly shall the time, sorry, even in Deuteronomy, so like Deuteronomy 14:23, and thou shalt eat before the Lord thy God in the place where he shall choose the place, the tithe of the corn. So in Deuteronomy, and if you read in this section, I believe it's this section or somewhere in Deuteronomy, it talks about the tithe where you're taking it as sort of a tithe of your pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And it says basically if you live a far or a long way from Jerusalem and you need to take your tithe there, but your food's not able to make the trip, basically, you sell that food, so sell it for money. So it's obvious here in the context that there is currency. It's not just that they were working and that's the only way they had money. They had currency in that time. And even in Jesus' time, there was currency. I love every time Jesus talks about tithing, he talks about food and herds. I'm not even sure he even talked about the herds. I know he talked about the mint and different other spices and things of that nature, but he always talks about food. And yet there's a time when people give currency to the church. So, the example of the widow who gave everything she had. She gave, I can't remember what the term for the coin she gave, but anyway, it was not very much. But Jesus said, verily I say unto you, she gave more than anyone else because they gave out of their abundance, which she gave in her need. And so I'm not against or saying that we shouldn't give even in our need, because I do believe there is blessing and even sort of a show of commitment to God in that. But there's never this place where Jesus himself talks about the tithe, or even the New Testament where it's talked about in regards to money. Never. And in fact, in Deuteronomy, like I said, he tells them to sell their food, to take that money, travel to Jerusalem, and then buy back the food so that they themselves can eat it in the temple. And again, this was basically either part of their tithe or it was a different type of tithe. But basically, they used that money so that they could make the trip to Jerusalem. So, all the mandatory trips that the Jews had to make. They needed to set aside set aside increase for that trip so that they could have food to eat and that sort of thing. And so it's obvious, that it was not talking about money because of the exchange of money, even in the verse in Deuteronomy, which is talking about the tithe, again, which is used to make the trip to Jerusalem. And so, for me, I'm looking at this and I'm saying, I don't see anything. There's nothing that I read in the Old Testament that suggests that the tithe had anything to do with one's income. And I don't see any logical argument, especially, looking back at, even in Jesus' time, there was definitely money. Okay, money is spoken of multiple times in the Gospels. And yet when he talks about tithing, he's always talking about the increase of the land. And I'm not sure if he ever talks about the herds, but I know, and if someone wants to, maybe give me a verse where he does talk about money in regards to tithing, then that's fine. But I don't believe there is. So, and even in the New Testament, nowhere is tithing commanded. Now Jesus talks about it, but if you want to look and talk about, but he talks about it, but Paul and all them, they never even mention the tithe, except for in the book of Hebrews. And it's just talking about how there's it's not even commanding tithing, but talking about how the Melchizedek, the preeminency of the order of Melchizedek versus the priests of Levites. So it's not even referring to us commanding us to tithe or anything. It's just, again, going through what the whole book of Hebrews is all about, which is that Christ is better than sort of the old sacrifices, and Christ's sacrifice is supreme. And so anyway, I just wanted to issue this again, not as a way to say I dare you to prove me wrong, but if I am wrong, which happens a lot, if I am wrong, you will be able to reason with me through the scriptures. And again, not to minimize testimony, but testimony is not should never be besides the testimony of Scripture, but the testimony of someone's experience should never supersede Scripture in developing one's doctrine. And so again, I'm not wanting to say that 10% is not a good percentage to give. I believe it is. But that it is not tithing, at least in the way that we have understood it today, meaning 10% of one's income, finances, money, okay, is not a commandment in Scripture. And so that's my stance. And I just want to, again, ask if anyone has biblical proof that I'm wrong, to please show it to me. I've kind of tried to touch the areas, where people tend to go to. Of course, people go to Malachi and say you're robbing from God. But again, what is the tithe in that situation? And then, of course, you have people who say we're no longer under the law. And so tithing has nothing to do with us. It has to do with, people say, I don't necessarily agree with his argument, but they say, it's part of I kind of agree with the fact that the tithe was based on some of the law was basically there to help the Jews be a good people and help in the civil relationships with one another. And so some people say that's what the tithe had to deal with, and so that's not applicable to us. I think there's some legitimacy in that argument. But for me, I look at it and I say, well, what was the tithe? It had to do with food, or the increase of the flock and of food. Okay, it has nothing to do with finances. They had money back then, so obviously, and he even tells them to sell the food for money at one point, so obviously it has nothing to do with finances. And then also, it's not commanded in the New Testament. Now, Paul obviously talks about giving, and I believe that, if he who gives sparingly will reap sparingly, and he who gives generously will reap generously. But again, there's no commandment of tithing in the New Testament. And so just want to throw that out there. Again, if anyone has comments, love to hear. Please, do it with this. Remember that, we as Christians, hopefully we're all seeking the truth. And let's love each other, and even when we disagree with each other. I love you guys. Hope to hear some comments, and thanks for listening.